Hey, what's up everybody? This is Paul, and what I want to do in this video is give a response to philosopher Wes Morriston's example of infinite praises. I don't want to call this a refutation or a rebuttal because the main way I've seen this argument used is it seems to be question begging and it would be invalid. And I don't think a philosopher like Wes Morriston would make an elementary mistake like this. So if I'm misunderstanding his argument, then hopefully somebody will correct me and be like, no, this is what he's actually saying. But I have seen it used in a question begging way, and I want to point this out because the people that do use it in this sort of way, this would be a rebuttal to this point. So let's go ahead and get started. So Wes Morriston brings this up a lot, and the main paper is one called Beginningless Past and Endless Future. It's in this journal, Faith and Philosophy, in 2012. And he gives this example of basically there being angels that are singing praises to God. So you assume God and heaven exist and these sorts of things. And basically saying how many praises will be sent. And I think we can simplify this example. So let's say there's someone named Craig who goes to heaven, and he's in heaven and he sings on each day a certain number of praises to God. And ideally, if God knows all these propositions, he's known how many praises Craig will sing on day 1 and day 2 and day 3 and day 4 and these sorts of things. But maybe we can simplify the analogy and just say, let's say there's somebody who's going to flip a coin and it's completely deterministic. And every day in heaven, they flip a coin and it's either heads or tails. So they flip the coin on day 1, flip the coin on day 2, flip the coin on day 3, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That way we don't have to worry about, is there free will, these sorts of things. It's completely determined, and theoretically God would know whether it's heads or tails at any given day. Now, the question that Wes Morriston wants to ask is how many praises will be said? And he argues that it can only be infinitely many. And I think this is wrong, and I'm going to explain why I think this is wrong. Fodor, in his book Unreasonable Faith, also brings this up, and he similarly asks the question, how many praises will have been said? So he cites Morriston's work. He cites Morriston's work a lot, actually. But really what this question comes down to is whether infinity is a number that can be actualized, or it's simply an idea that is not a number at all. If it's an idea of infinitude, of just lack of a finite bound, then if it's not a number, then the question how many praises will be said is actually an ill-defined problem. It's an ill-defined question. It's like dividing by 0. We don't actually have a definition because there's no cognitive meaning in that sentence. That way, in this case, when you say how many praises will be said at a given time, this will always be a finite actualizable number because you have to be able to write down the number or actualize the number for this question to even have coherent or make coherent sense. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. When I ask how many praises will have been said, I need to specify when. This is what I mean by it being indeterminate or ill-defined. I mean, if you say how many praises will have been said at day 13, or how many heads or tails have there been at day 13 or day 27, it's very clear. But it seems like Fodor and Morriston, or Morriston and then Fodor by citing Morriston, want to ask how many will have been said at infinity or will have ever been said. And if there never will be an end, if there will never be reaching infinity because it cannot be actualized, because it is always a limit and not an actualizable number that can be written down or even inserted into a sentence like this, then this question falls apart and the answer is not infinity. It's that the question doesn't really mean anything because it's not having any cognitive sort of meaning. That's kind of the point I want to make. And in particular, I think this begs the question in favor of an actual infinite existing because the purpose of this question, at least in Fodor's book Unreasonable Faith, is to try to argue an actual infinite series of past events can exist. So then it ends up presupposing that infinity can be actualized to show that an actual infinite is possible. And that's where it begs the question, and that's why this is an invalid argument. And I think Craig's reply, rather than dodge his question, points this out. And it's funny because Fodor actually cites Craig's reply here, and Craig points this out. He says, if the series of future praises goes on forever, there will never be uttered an actually infinite number of praises. Rather, infinity serves merely as the limit to which you endlessly approach, but you never arrive at. The number of praises is always finite. So when you ask how many praises will there have been at X, X can be any finite. X will always be a finite number because you will never be able to write down an infinite number, and there's never like an infinite day that you can actually actualize. Because if you could actualize it, then the next day would be infinity plus 1. So and that wouldn't be infinity. Tomorrow would be greater than today. So it's just kind of ridiculous. And I think Fodor makes a point because he says rather the argument is that now the case that there are infinitely many future tense facts about praises that will be uttered in the future. So his argument is that it is now the case that there are an infinitely many future tense facts about praises. So God would know how many praises are at day 1 and day 2 and day 3, et cetera, et cetera. But this only makes sense if there are infinitely many future days that can be actualized in a set. And if that's not a thing, if that's simply just a goal that will never be achieved, then if you ask, well, how many facts about each day, it's always a finite collection that tends to be growing. Fodor also says, it is true that every event in the future will occur in a finite amount of time from the present, since, as Craig says, it is impossible to count to infinity. However, this is in no way inconsistent with there being an actually infinite number of events that will occur in the future. Once again, if it is impossible to count to infinity, then it is impossible for there to have ever been a future number of events that have been constructed starting from today. It will always be a finite number. It will always be a finite distance away from today. And as I showed in a previous video, we cannot achieve an infinite from successive addition. So asking how many will there have been at infinity begs the question in favor of infinity being actualized, which would contradict just the idea of infinity in the first place, which is non-finiteness, not pinned downness, not able to be actualized, and not able to therefore be formed by successive addition through any finite time. And to say, okay, in an infinite amount of time, I can fully go through an infinite thing is kind of ridiculous because there's no end to the infinite amount of time. So it's like saying, like, at what day will God know there will have been an infinite number of praises? That's kind of a ridiculous question too, because there's no finite day. And if you don't accept infinity as a number, then it becomes very clear that what the content of this question is. Another thing, it's kind of like asking, okay, is there an actual smallest number closest to 0 not equal to 0? And I want to say the answer is no. If you tell me what that number is, I can just divide it by 2 and get even closer. So there's no actual smallest number closest to 0 because it is an open set whose limit point is 0. And any number you can give me can be divided. As soon as you write it down, there's always something a little bit closer and a little bit closer. So it's better. I think this line of thinking about trying to treat infinity like any other number is misguided. And as I've tried to show in some other videos, it leads to all these sorts of problems. So the best thing to do, I think, is to say, whoa. We have these intuitions about finite numbers. And Morriston even makes this point. Why think our intuitions extend to infinite numbers? And with that intuition, why assume that it exists in the same way that a finite collection can exist? Fodor asks this, so even if God's knowledge is non-propositional, it must still be the case that God knows an infinite number of facts about the future. That only works if an infinite number of things can exist in the future, or an infinite number of future events do exist or will have existed. And if you deny those things, then you can claim that God will always know a finite collection of things because there never will have been an infinite number of things. There's no closure to this set. Once again, an infinite number of future propositions only makes sense if there is an actual infinite number of future days or future time. And if you deny that that infinite number of future days or future time will have ever occurred, notice the sort of the language there, will have occurred or will have ever occurred, period, then you can claim that the number of propositions will always be finite because you will always be a finite distance away from any given starting point. And once again, the problem here is Fodor tries to use this to argue that an actual regress of infinite events is possible, that you can have something existing for an infinite amount of time. And this doesn't work if you are already skeptical of infinity being actualizable in the sense that we've been talking about it. Fodor mentions it like this: nevertheless, it is also true that the number of future events that will occur is infinite. What else could it be? Now, this is an argument from incredulity. It could always be infinite. It could always be a finite number if infinity can never be actually reached. Or we instead define infinity as I do, like a limit or as a process. Craig defines it as a limit. I define it as an idea and not an actual number. So therefore, the number of future events was finite. And this is kind of like a category error where you assume that infinity is actualizable like any other number simply because we define it as a series of numbers, where infinity isn't actually a number in the same way that these other numbers are. So you'll never reach it in this particular case. So the number of future events that will have occurred will always be finite. The number of future events that will occur is a number that tends towards infinity but is not infinite. And the other problem here, so Craig is a presentist, right? So he denies that future events exist in some sort of infinite set out there, that you're just kind of pulling from this infinite set and adding them to the present. And as a presentist, he doesn't believe that these future events actually exist in any particular way. So you're never completed the collection of infinite items. You can still say, okay, God knows propositions about any finite number of thing, and if you ask God, like the proposition, how many praises will be sung at day X, God would know the answer to that question. But there's no necessarily idea that the closure of the set is somehow an infinite set, because that assumes that you've somehow pinned down the infinite nature of infinity itself. So let me give you an analogy here. I think this will be helpful. I can build a video game on a discrete system, meaning it has a discrete number of transistors, a discrete amount of memory, et cetera, that appears to have an infinite distance, but where nothing is truly infinite. So think about Minecraft. Minecraft's a good example. Minecraft is a game that runs on a computer that is like a finite Turing machine. It's a discrete system. It's running on a computer that has a discrete number of transistors. Everything is pretty much discrete, from clocks to the gates to the flip-flops to all this stuff. Just because I can look at any distance on the screen and say, okay, this house that I built in Minecraft is 4 blocks wide, and each block has, let's say, unit 1. And then I can divide that 1 unit block into 2 units, and those 2 units into 4 units, and those 4 units into 8 1/8ths of the blocks. It never means that there's any infinite in this game or in this process at all. It just means I can theoretically keep dividing things the way I would think about it, even though the number of blocks in the Minecraft world is always finite, and even though these distances are numbers, I'm conceptualizing them, there's no infinite in this at all. And in a similar way, some people have argued that the Planck scale forms a sort of sampling rate or limit to our universe. Of course, simulation theorists are going to have a field day. They brought up this point before that, okay, maybe we're living in a computer because it seems like this is the case. I don't want to go down that road, but what I want to say with this is it's certainly conceivable that even all of our spatial observations, not just the fact that there are a finite number of elementary particles, which I don't think is a controversial claim, but even our spatial observations can only be divided or subdivided practically down to a certain point, even if theoretically we can imagine dividing them and dividing them and dividing them. So once again, there's no reason to necessarily think that an infinite needs to actually be actualized for anything to exist or for us to be able to do anything. Once again, if we treat infinity like it's an idea or like it's this sort of way out there limit process rather than anything that can be pinned down, I think it puts us in a good place. So hopefully this video was interesting, or at least brought up some questions. Once again, I really do think Fodor's use of this and Morriston's point are question begging, in the sense that they assume that an infinite set of things can exist, and that's their proposition. And if you deny that proposition, then anything that falls out that uses that as a proposition, P1 being an infinite number of items, or an infinite set can be actualized or can be counted to, or these sorts of things, you end up not having to worry about it. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.